Welcome all to our Betty Strong Encounter Center presentation for January the 31st, 2021. I'm Scott Culpepper, and I'm delighted to be with you virtually and continue to look forward to the day when we can be together once again, face to face. Our presentation today is Thomas Paine, Voice of Revolutions. We'll be discussing one of our most gifted founding fathers, but also one of the most controversial of the founding fathers. Thomas Paine rose to tremendous heights and also fell to devastating blows throughout the course of his career. Unfortunately, by the time he died in 1809, he had so alienated his former colleagues and raised so much controversy that only about 6 people attended his funeral at La Rochelle, New York. Paine was born in 1737, though this, like much of his life, is complicated. He actually was born January 29th, 1736, according to the old style calendar that was observed in England at the time of his birth. But of course, later in 1752, England shifted to the new style Gregorian calendar, which most of Europe was already following. They wanted to be in step with the rest of Europe. And when they did so, that would set the date of Paine's birth at February the 9th, 1737. So generally, historians say he was born in 1737, but under the old calendar, the new year actually began in March, whereas under the new Gregorian style calendar, it began in January, as it of course does now. And so technically Paine was born in 1736. That was what was noted as the date of his birth, but by our reckoning, he was born in 1737. He was born the son of Joseph and Frances Paine, and yes, the spelling on the PowerPoint is correct. The name was originally spelled P-A-I-N. This may well have been a foreshadowing of all the difficult things that Paine was going to endure throughout the course of his life. We don't know exactly when he started using the E. Some historians and literary scholars thought at one time that possibly he started to use it as a literary convention once he started publishing, but it appears that he was using it as early as 1769 before he had published any major works. So it just seems at some point he decided that the name would work better with the E on the end. Maybe he changed it to prevent people like me from making jokes at his expense like the one that I just made. As a boy, he was educated at the Thetford Grammar School. He was born in Thetford, Norfolk. The grammar school was reputed to be a very good one, and here he learned the basics of reading and writing. He probably engaged with ancient Greco-Roman texts and myths. This set the tone for much of his work later on and provided the essential tools for his writing career. His father was a corset maker or a stay maker, meaning that he sewed whalebone into ladies' garments and sold them at often lucrative prices. Corset makers were not among the wealthiest by any stretch, but they did make a fairly comfortable living. And Paine was primed to be apprenticed to his father and eventually to take up the trade as well. At the age of 13, he left the grammar school and he became his father's apprentice. But eventually he sort of tired of the idea of being a corset maker and aspired to possibly do something else. To that end, in the late 1750s, he actually hired out on a privateer as a privateer on a merchant vessel and spent some time at sea. Eventually, he did tire of that and decided maybe a more settled life was what he wanted. And so he returned to England. He moved to the region of Kent. And in 1759, he set up shop as a corset maker. So he's come full circle. He gets married that same year to a servant girl by the name of Mary Lambert. She does not appear to have been a person of great means at all, so this was not something that was done for Paine's financial advantage. It does appear to have been what they would call a love match. They got married in 1759. She got pregnant soon afterwards, and sadly, she ends up dying in childbirth about a year later. Their infant also died, and Paine is left bereft. He is a widower, and he has lost his child at a very young age. In 1761, he leaves the corset making business and becomes an excise officer, charged with collecting taxes. These were taxes of all kinds: personal taxes, taxes from businesses, customs taxes. Paine was posted in a number of places around the southeast of England, moved several times to accept new excise posts, and throughout the course of this career also got caught up in some of the agitation that was coming from the excise officers who felt like they weren't being paid well and weren't being treated fairly and didn't receive appropriate benefits from the English government. And so Paine found himself throughout the end of his excise career, or towards the end of his excise career, agitating on their behalf. Paine was a born rabble-rouser, much like Samuel Adams, and this begins to come out during the excise period, as he's often called on to step forward and speak out in defense of the excise officers within his union or his fraternity. He eventually comes to live above a grocery and tobacco shop during one of his later excise postings, and it's here that he meets Elizabeth Olive and eventually marries her in 1771. When his father-in-law dies, he inherits the business along with his wife. And so from 1772 to 1774, Paine actually works as a grocer and a seller of tobacco, as well as continuing to ply the excise trade. And his experiences there had been somewhat uneven. He had done very well in that capacity, but there were a couple of times when he was actually accused of not collecting appropriate funds, not collecting as much as he was supposed to, and being absent from his post. And so there were stages within this period from 1761 to 1774 when Paine was cast out of an excise position and sort of in the wilderness for a little bit, and then he'd be welcomed back into the trade. He published in 1772 The Case of the Officers of Excise, and here he made a literary plea for better pay and treatment of excise officials. It was probably this publication and his continued support of their appeals that put him finally on the wrong side of the British officials who were in charge of overseeing excise permanently. They had basically endured him for most of the previous decade, and by 1774, they were finally tired of dealing with him. And so in 1774, he loses his excise position. At the same time, his business failed, and so he lost the grocery, and his wife divorced him. Those three things were certainly related. The stresses in his professional life definitely caused stress in his personal life, although by most accounts, his married life was not very settled from the very beginning. And this second marriage doesn't seem to have gone well at all. They seem to have been mismatched from the very earliest days of his relationship with Elizabeth Olive. So it wasn't a surprise to many when that marriage relationship deteriorated and eventually dissolved. Paine was standing in the midst of absolute failure at the age of 37. His business gone, his marriage dissolved, and now pretty much he's permanently cast out of the excise fraternity. He did have one very important thing going for him, though. One of his friends in the excise fraternity, in the excise union, had invited him to dinner with a very important visitor from the United States, or actually at this time it was still the colonies. That person was Benjamin Franklin, who was there on behalf of the colonies, speaking with Parliament, hoping to get consideration for their grievances against the Crown regarding taxation. Franklin was taken with Paine, and he told Paine that he should really journey to the colonies and start over there, that there he could find opportunities to make his fortune and a new life, new hope for himself. Franklin actually drafted a letter for Paine so that Paine would be granted access to all the highest circles of influence should he decide to come to Philadelphia. It didn't take long for Paine to take Franklin up on his offer. There was nothing left for Paine in England, and so in 1774, he set out aboard ship, sailing across the Atlantic. He reached Philadelphia in the fall, and when he reached Philadelphia, he was in very dire straits. Typhoid fever had broken out on the vessel that he was traveling on, and Paine was desperately sick when the ship reached harbor. One of Franklin's friends had been sent to meet Paine, and when Paine didn't come ashore, the friend went on board the boat and found Paine absolutely unable to get up and come ashore himself. And so this friend of Franklin's had Paine carried ashore, where he soon received medical attention. Paine, of course, recovered, and within a few months, he acquires a position as the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine. Magazines had not fared well in the colonies. They started, they ran a brief period, and then usually they ended up going bankrupt. The Pennsylvania Magazine was the latest venture to try to chart a success for these sorts of periodical publications. Paine becomes the editor, and the magazine becomes fairly successful throughout 1775 and into early 1776. Paine writes a number of articles for the magazine, and his style is very agreeable to readers in the colonies. One of his important early essays demonstrated his attitude towards the slave trade. This is one of the notable things about Paine. Among the pantheon of American founders, Paine is one of the most consistent in regard to his objections to slavery. He never thought it should be tolerated, and he never changed his position throughout the course of his career. In 1775, he published an article called African Slavery in America, in which he challenged the rationale and the morality of the slave trade. The American Revolution, of course, was beginning, and the agitation of the colonists against the king soon swept Thomas Paine into that orbit. In early 1776, conflict had already begun. It began at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and the Second Continental Congress was now going to be meeting to determine what exactly should the colonies do. Should they continue to petition for redress of grievances, or should they take the final step of actually separating from the mother country? Paine was of the mind that the colonies should absolutely separate. He thought it was a very natural sort of thing. At one point, he argued that the colonists had been dining on milk and doing well on that during the time they were subjects to England, but it was time for the colonies now to dine on meat and to become an entity in their own right. In January of 1776, Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. This pamphlet called on Americans to support the push for a complete break from the mother country and gave Paine's rationale for why this was necessary, why it was not only necessary, but it was destined to be because of the nature of the colonies and the potential that lay ahead of them. He argued that it was ridiculous for such a great continent to be ruled over by one small island. He challenged the notion of hereditary monarchy and argued that, in fact, both monarchy and aristocracy are not only burdensome, they are unnatural, that there's something inherently unnatural about imposing these sorts of hierarchies on human beings. Common Sense was pretty well received by people throughout the colonies, and of course it antagonized those who were Tories, those who are still committed to the cause of Great Britain. At first, people didn't know who had published it. Paine had written it anonymously, and it took a while for people to figure out who it was. John Adams, who is perennially grumpy and often jealous, very much admired many of the sentiments in the pamphlet, but he felt like those sentiments were put in a very rough sort of way. And in his letters, he noted that for a while he was in doubt who had been responsible for the pamphlet, and that eventually, upon investigation, he discovered that it was an individual by the name of Paine. Adams is going to have an interesting attitude towards Paine. He finds Paine somewhat insufferable in regard to Paine's sort of street brawler way of putting things, his way of arguing so crassly in Adams' opinion. Yet at the same time, Adams recognizes his giftedness, and later in his career, Adams is going to resent it because Adams fears Paine's reputation is going to overshadow that of his and some of the other founders as well. Despite the many negative things Adams will say about Paine, one of the positive things he said about Paine at one point was that the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain were it not for the pen of Thomas Paine. The sword of Washington would have been raised in vain were it not for the pen of Thomas Paine. That's pretty high praise coming from someone who was involved from the very beginning in the arguments that led to the Declaration of Independence. In fact, one of the reasons why Adams was so put out with Paine was because he had been making similar arguments at a higher level to the elite culture in the United States, but Paine had a way of connecting with the common person and putting those complex arguments in language that ordinary people could understand. So this is part of what irritated Adams, was that he had been making these arguments, but Paine was getting credit for it in popular culture because Paine was able to translate these ideas in a way that ordinary people could understand. Paine continues to write throughout 1776 in support of the American cause, and he begins to write a series of pamphlets called The American Crisis. These pamphlets were so popular that George Washington often encouraged people to read them. In fact, in December of 1776, just before the Battle of Trenton, when Washington crossed the Delaware, he had the first pamphlet of the American crisis read to his assembled troops to prepare them for the coming battle. These are the times that try men's souls. And Paine goes on to talk about how the sunshine patriot, the person who's in it just for convenience, they are not going to last. But the one who is serious, the one who is committed, that one is going to be the stock of which this new nation is going to be made of, the foundation upon which this new nation will rest. He says, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, but we rest in the assurance that the more difficult the struggle, the more glorious the victory. Paine's prose was soaring. It was inspiring. He had an ability to captivate his audience. And certainly this kind of prose was tremendous fuel for the fire as the colonists faced some of the most difficult early years of the American Revolution. Paine also did take part in actual civic affairs during the time when he was writing these pamphlets as well. So he wasn't just an inspirer or a stoker of revolution. He was involved in the mechanics of it as well. In 1777, he was invited to be on the Committee on Foreign Affairs for the Articles of Confederation Congress. He served in this capacity for several years. Unfortunately, that service came to an end because he and a few other members of the committee criticized Silas Deane, another member of their committee, due to the financial kickbacks he was getting through work that he was doing for the committee. They felt that this was unsavory and unethical. Paine raised objections, and Paine is always the one to carry these things forward and step out in front of everyone else. Because of that, he received tremendous criticism, particularly from Gouverneur Morris, and in the end felt like he should resign the committee. In hindsight, a couple of years later, more information came out about Silas Deane's dealings. And as that information did come out, a lot of people reversed their opinion, so much so that later on, Morris is going to actually apologize to Paine for Paine's rough treatment on the committee. They began to realize that Paine was more correct about what was going on in the shadows than they had previously realized. Paine continues to serve the interest of the Confederation Congress, and he also is going to serve for a while in the Continental Army as an aide-de-camp to Nathaniel Greene. He will write in 1780 a work called Public Good. And here, once again, Paine is the man of pure morals, the agitator for all that is right. And he often doesn't realize how much his agitation and his criticism is going to run afoul of people, particularly whose support he might need. In this case, in his article, Public Good, he argues that all the land west of the settled colonies is land that actually belongs to the American government. And he notes that a lot of people had staked claims early on under the British government to push their holdings outside of the colonies where they lived. There had been certain prominent families that had decided to do this, and they had staked claims to vast territories that they had not begun to improve in the Old Northwest, and possibly even further than they had ever been themselves. Paine argued that this just wasn't right, and that land west of the settled colonies should belong to the federal government, to be done with, to be disseminated as the federal government chose. Paine actually is eventually going to win this argument. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is actually going to function much as Paine wanted, with the government distributing land and determining who was able to stake a claim for particular pieces of territory. Now, the reason why this caused a problem for Paine is because among those wealthy families that had established land claims outside the settled colonies were family names such as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. And so many of his revolutionary colleagues got very put out with Paine because his argument that all this land should be administered by the United States government, well, this sort of ran afoul of their personal interest. And so many of them got frustrated with Paine for making this argument. Now, Paine is going to continue to serve in international affairs throughout the 1780s. His service on the Foreign Committee during the period of the Confederation Congress is going to continue to guide the sort of posts that he receives. He's going to spend a lot of time in the 1780s journeying back and forth between the new United States, England, and also France. There's some discussion, some doubt at this point about where his citizenship actually lies. I mean, technically, he's part of the American Revolutionary Movement. He helps to found the United States, but he has a certain comfort level with being known as an English citizen. He does travel back and forth and stay in England throughout the 1780s. And yet, increasingly throughout the 1780s, he also spends quite a bit of time in France. He is very enthralled with French culture, and he's very interested in some of the potential revolutionary movements that seem to be beginning to form in France, especially towards the end of the 1780s. By 1787, he is back in England. And while he is there, the events begin to unfold that lead to the French Revolution. At the same time, of course, the American Constitution is being written, and the new permanent American government is being put in place as well. As Paine begins to observe the affairs of the French and all of the arguments that are leading to the early years of the French Revolution, Paine feels like their cause is similar to that of the Americans. He feels that they also have been oppressed by hereditary monarchy and aristocratic privilege, and that here again is a people who need to throw off the chains of monarchy and aristocracy and embrace a republican style of government. Paine is quick to encourage them to do that and wants very much to be a part of inspiring them in their struggle. Of course, as most of you know, the French Revolution aspires to be like the American Revolution, and in its very earliest phases, it looks maybe slightly like the American Revolution. In fact, when the French National Assembly adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that document is co-authored by the Marquis de Lafayette and by Thomas Jefferson. So there certainly are American influences at play here. But of course, the French Revolution turns out to be a very different sort of affair from the American Revolution. One person who sensed that was the Irish parliamentarian and very prominent leader of the British conservative movement, Edmund Burke. Burke wrote a book in 1790 called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And Burke, who had actually been sympathetic towards the American Revolution, predicted disaster for the French Revolution. He was very concerned about where things were going. He found the rhetoric of the Revolution to be tending towards radicalism, lawlessness to be just around the corner, and potential upheaval and anarchy, the inevitable result of what he saw developing in France. Paine was frustrated with Burke's attitude. Burke had been a friend during the American Revolution. He had been a great supporter. He had helped the American cause in Parliament. And now here he was denouncing a movement that Paine felt to be very similar to the American Revolution. So Paine took up his pen in 1791, and he wrote the first part of The Rights of Man. The Rights of Man is Paine's defense of the French Revolution, his challenge to Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, and sort of his magnum opus, his greatest work extolling the virtues of human liberty and of republican government. He's later going to publish in 1792 The Rights of Man Part 2. By the time that second part was published, Paine was already in France, having left England under threat of prosecution. He's going to be prosecuted for sedition, for the things that he wrote in The Rights of Man, and for seditious libel for attacking Edmund Burke in his writings. By that time, he was beyond the reach of the English government because he was actually serving in the French Assembly. And of course, if you know anything about the early history of the French Revolution, French governing bodies are going to go through a number of changes and evolutions during this period. Eventually, the body that will rise to power in the fall of 1792 is the National Convention. And Paine will occupy a place in the National Convention, a place that had actually been secured for him before he ever arrived in France. In that capacity, he tried to help shape policy. Now, this is a very interesting situation because Paine is very willing. He is obviously a very gifted stoker of revolutionary fires, but the man does not even speak French well. Imagine trying to navigate just day to day in the streets not speaking French very well, much less trying to engage in high governmental discourse, not understanding the language in which it's being conducted. So this was challenging for Paine, to say the least. Another thing, of course, is challenging is that the convention is made up of some very radical souls. Whatever moderate phase the French Revolution experienced in its beginnings was long gone. Even Heroes of the early revolution, like the Marquis de Lafayette, were now being branded as enemies of the state. Maximilien Robespierre was about to rise to power within the convention, and his influence was already being felt. Robespierre and those around him were purists of the ultimate kind. They were wanting to make sure that everybody was a true son or daughter of the revolution. And essentially that meant someone who was a true son or daughter as defined by them. So Paine begins to experience what Edmund Burke had feared. The moderate, sober revolution that he had hoped to cultivate there was not to be had. Once the hounds had been unleashed, there was no controlling them. You can certainly galvanize popular opinion. You can engage in populist rhetoric to inflame people. But once you have done it, you will not control it. History proves it over and over again. It is impossible to control where those streams are going to go. The French are finding that out in the early 1790s. Paine is experiencing it to his deep chagrin. The straw that breaks the camel's back for Paine is when he defends Louis XVI, the former king of France, as Louis is being put on trial for his life. Paine argues that it is not proper or appropriate to execute the king. That one, it is not a good example, that Louis, in fact, would benefit from being exiled to the United States, where he might see the virtues of how free people live. And also, Paine argues that morally, the death penalty is just not right, that it is not proper to take a human life in this way. Many of the revolutionaries are, of course, very eager to see Louis XVI die. When Paine is making his speech in the convention, Jean-Paul Marat, the infamous newspaper editor, actually questions whether Paine's speech is being translated correctly, because surely Paine understands that Louis must die. When Paine insists that, in fact, he is being translated correctly, then Marat attempts to shut him down, as do other members of the assembly as well. Louis, of course, is going to be guillotined, and Paine is eventually going to be exiled from the convention. Paine is okay with that by this point because he has begun to be disillusioned with the direction of the French Revolution. He retires to his home. He is in the midst of writing a new work, a work known as The Age of Reason, when in December of 1793, there's a knock at the door and Paine is arrested. He is taken to prison to await execution by guillotine. And it is only because of a mix-up in the prison that he actually is not executed. The door to his cell was marked incorrectly, and on the appointed day for his execution, he was passed over. And so Paine ends up surviving. One of the reasons why they were having so much trouble getting him out of prison is because of the doubt that we mentioned previously about his citizenship. Was he a British citizen? Well, if so, he was in trouble because they had already condemned him in absentia in England, and they were very ready for him to return because they would like to throw him in prison themselves. Was he a citizen of the United States? Well, he had helped with the revolution, but he had never formally declared American citizenship, so to some, it was somewhat in doubt. Gouverneur Morris was the ambassador of the United States in Paris at that time. And if you'll recall, Morris had had some tense moments, especially when he had worked on the Committee for Foreign Relations during the Revolutionary period. And according to Paine later, and you have to remember that Paine was often feeling very persecuted and ill-used, but according to Paine later, he said Morris really did not try that hard to secure his release, that Morris did not push his claim to American citizenship. Once Morris was replaced, his replacement, James Monroe, the future fifth president of the United States, did work very hard to push Paine's American citizenship claim and did ultimately secure his release. By the time Paine was released in 1794, he had already published the first part of The Age of Reason, and in 1795, he would publish the second part as well. In Paine's eyes, works like Common Sense, The Rights of Man, and The Age of Reason sort of formed a body of work, a trilogy almost, which noted some of the major emphases that he wanted to advance regarding the nature of human freedom, regarding the nature of Republican government, and in The Age of Reason regarding the nature of religion and belief in ultimate things. The Age of Reason is one of Paine's most famous and also most controversial works. Many people celebrate his works that led to the American Revolution, or even combine those with the rights of man, this work that argues for the French Revolution, and celebrate those while glossing over the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason is Paine's concerted attack on organized religion. Paine was essentially a deist, which means someone who believed in God, believed that God had established the natural laws of the universe, but he did not believe in the supernatural aspects of Christianity, the divinity of Christ, atonement, the inspiration of the Bible, things of that nature. Paine says that very clearly in The Age of Reason. He says at one point, "My own mind is my own church." He said that he did believe in one God and that there are good things that one could anticipate in the life to come. But he also continued he didn't believe in the creed of the Jews, of the Turks or Muslims, of the Eastern Church, meaning the Orthodox Church, of the Roman Church, meaning the Catholic Church, or of the Protestant churches. Paine said he didn't believe in the creeds of any of the established religions of Western culture at that time. The thing about Paine's skepticism that was novel was that he was pushing it to a point where he was challenging the existence of organized religion and casting organized religion as an oppressive power. There were a lot of elites who had these skeptical thoughts. In fact, there are some among the American founders that had similar thoughts in regard to the nature of the Bible, who also embraced some deist inclinations. The big difference, though, is that even the most skeptical of the other founders, people like, say, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, still argued for the value of organized religion, even if they questioned some aspects of it or the supernatural aspects of it. Franklin, when he died, his funeral cortege was accompanied by representatives from every single church in Philadelphia. And Franklin, though he had supported the evangelistic campaigns of George Whitefield and often published sermons in his newspapers, he was known to be very skeptical of basic tenets of the Christian faith. But he was still widely respected by most of the religious adherents of Philadelphia, people who believed very deeply in their faith, because he was friendly to religion. He believed that religion served an important public good. Where Paine runs afoul of his colleagues here is that he does not. He sees organized religion as oppressive and something that, along with hereditary monarchy and aristocracy, should be cast aside. He attacks the Bible with vehement language in The Age of Reason. And so this is the moment when many people who had embraced Paine as a colleague, co-worker, and had admired him greatly parted ways with him. And as we're going to see, there are going to be a couple of other things that caused that to happen as well. During this period, Paine is actually convalescing at the home of James Monroe, and he spends the next decade, or the next 5 years, the end of this decade, staying with various friends in and around Paris. He does work with the government that arose after the fall of Robespierre for a little bit, and he even at one point is courted by the rising Napoleon Bonaparte, who wants Paine to be an advocate for him. Paine is actually allured by Napoleon at first, and he does offer initial support, although, like many other people, by the time Napoleon begins to rise to emperorship in 1803 and 1804, Paine has begun to realize that Napoleon is basically just an autocrat clothing himself in democratic guise. And so Paine, of course, comes to repudiate Napoleon, as many others did as well, as simply another tyrant trying to disguise himself with shades of democracy and republicanism. Well, Paine continues to push things in a couple of areas further and further, and this is going to gain him quite a bit of infamy. He writes a work called Agrarian Justice in 1795, a work which extols the virtue of those who work with the land and argues for proper treatment of them. Paine is the sort of person who, in many ways, envisions what today we might call sort of a proto-welfare state. The last part of his Rights of Man theorizes about the possibility of how one could regulate society in such a way that wages were fair. And interestingly enough, even circles around to the point where he proposes a sort of minimum income or a set income for everyone, an idea that's gained some traction today. In Agrarian Justice, he is very assertive of the rights of people who hold land and also of protections for those who are not landholders, but advocates that those people who don't hold land should have a part participating in the body politic as well. In 1796, he writes, or actually publishes, his letter to George Washington. He had written it a little bit earlier, and he had tried to get Gouverneur Morris and then James Monroe to send it on to Washington, which they refused to do. In this letter, he expresses frustration with Washington because Washington, in his opinion, had not done enough to assist the French in their revolution. He felt that France had been betrayed by Washington after their support for the colonists in the American Revolution, and he also felt that he personally had been betrayed by Washington. He criticizes George Washington roundly and essentially tries to make the case that Washington doesn't deserve the accolades he's received as either a military or political leader. People certainly were a little bit freer about criticizing Washington at this point because he was close to the end of his presidency. And, there had been a lot of political controversy during his presidency. So it wasn't like no one criticized Washington. There were critics of Washington, but no one criticized them in the way that Paine did. And certainly even Washington's harshest critics in the United States still had a venerable respect for the man and for his legacy. And so when Paine unleashed on Washington in the way that he did, publishing this letter for all to read, it really was the beginning of the end of his association with many of the leading founders. His antagonism towards organized religion, coupled with his antagonism towards George Washington, drove many to distance themselves from Paine. Thomas Jefferson was one in particular who never quite gave up on Paine in terms of personal relationship, but even Jefferson found it difficult to be associated with Paine publicly. In 1800, when Jefferson ran for president, many people challenged Jefferson and called him an atheist, and in fact said that he and Paine were in league with one another, both trying to bring down organized religion, something that Jefferson, of course, argued was not true. And that, in fact, even Paine, he argued, was being misunderstood, although he didn't stick his neck out for Paine very much because it was obvious at this point that association with Paine was toxic. In 1802, Jefferson did, as president, grant Paine permission to return to the United States, which Paine did. By this point, there was little reason for him to remain in Paris, and so he determined to go back to his adopted land. But once he arrived back in the U.S., there was not a lot for him there either. Many people felt like Paine had burned too many bridges with them. They were concerned about the toxic connection of associating with him, of gaining infamy themselves by being too closely aligned with him. And so Paine pretty much from 1802 found himself to be a bit of a pariah. At one point, he tried to vote in an election at New Rochelle, where his farm was located. This farm had been given to him by Congress in 1785 in recognition for his work during the American Revolution. And so he's living on this farm and he's settled back in the United States, where he goes to New Rochelle to vote in a local election. And he ends up going away without voting because they can't find proper documentation that he is a citizen. So the man who helped to coin the term United States of America is not allowed to vote in a local election. There's so many tragic ironies of Paine's life. The last few years are desperate for Paine. Stories abound of people running into him in New Rochelle or in New York City, especially at Greenwich Village, where he liked to sort of hang out, go to bars and see various people he was acquainted with. The stories talk about how rough he was, how desperate he seemed, how grouchy he became increasingly in those last few years. The stories were not flattering, and it appears that he was indeed sort of declining. There have been some that have argued that possibly Paine was prone to depression throughout his life, that it might explain some of the radical swings that we witnessed throughout his career. Some have even gone so far as to argue that possibly he suffered from some kind of bipolar disorder. Of course, all we can do is speculate. We have things that we know today that we can basically explore with people who are living, but oftentimes all we can do is guess at things from symptoms that are recorded in regard to people who lived in the past and try to fit them into our modern categories. But it's hard because you can't really diagnose these things very well from historical distance. whatever Paine's afflictions, his last years were very hard, and he tended to live under a cloud of infamy. It's ironic because it's at this very time in 1805 that Adams is writing some of the things I talked about earlier and sort of lamenting that, in fact, this will be known as the Age of Paine. And to some degree, he's correct. For all the infamy of the Age of Reason, if you look at charts that historians construct of this period, when they refer to the period of the Enlightenment, the 18th and 19th century, very early 19th century, they'll often call it the Age of Reason after Thomas Paine's pamphlet. And so in a way, John Adams was correct that though Paine himself was overshadowed for a little while, his title Age of Reason and his emphases on the rights of humanity, those become hallmarks of his age, and this is the way the age is labeled. Paine himself is going to end up dying in Greenwich Village in 1809. The actual structure that he passed away in is not there anymore, but there is a business located on the grounds where he died. And as you see on the slide, there's a plaque there that notes that this is the place where Thomas Paine died. So if you're in New York City and you have the opportunity, there's a bar located on a street corner, and it's in that area where Thomas Paine passed away. The house where he died is located there. As I said, only 6 people attended his funeral in 1809 when he's buried at New Rochelle. He had a very curious afterlife. William Cobbett, the radical newspaper editor and organizer from England, who was known to be part of several radical movements in the 19th century. At one point, he actually wanted to exhume Paine's bones, which he did, and then give them a proper honorable burial in England, which he never got to. Cobbett had the bones dug up, shipped to England. He kept them around, but then Cobbett never got around to having a funeral ceremony. And after he died, the bones were dispersed to all corners. No one knows where they all got to. For a long time, people were claiming to possess different body parts, different bones of Thomas Paine. So his body eventually just sort of disappears piece by piece without a trace. Today, we have no idea where all those pieces are located. Throughout the 19th century, he really didn't get his due, but finally in the 1890s, an extended biography was written. It was actually written by an associate of Abraham Lincoln by the name of Conway. Abraham Lincoln himself had been a great admirer of Paine's work and had written a couple of treatises, one actually speaking admiringly of the Age of Reason. It was said by his colleagues that that particular publication was suppressed because they didn't want Lincoln later in his political career being too associated with Paine's reputation as kind of an arch deist. Throughout the 20th century, his reputation improved. And here at the beginning of the 21st century, a lot of people are very fascinated with Paine for a number of reasons. Several great studies have been written in recent years. One of the classic ones is by the historian Eric Foner. And one of the more recent ones is written by Merrill Giles Unger. It's called Thomas Paine and the Clarion Call for American Independence. And this particular work looks at Paine in light of recent scholarship and contemporary events. And overall, it seems that the appreciation for Paine has risen because a lot of the themes that he talks about in his writings continue to resonate with us today. A lot of the controversies that he writes about are still with us. Controversies regarding the nature of this American experiment, what it is and what it could be. And, questions about the nature of religion. We continue to find important debates about religion and the relationship of religion to public life surfacing in contemporary American culture. Well, Paine addressed those very abrasively, but he did address those. And so those writings by Paine are gaining renewed attention as people, again, drill down into some of these very important questions that continue to fascinate us. Thomas Paine was a person of tremendous gifts, and above all else, he was sort of an inspirer and an encourager and an advocate for causes that he felt like were just. Of course, at the same time, his drive to inspire, his drive to inflame could be a weakness because it often caused him to run afoul of those who would be his allies and often caused him to lose sight of the technical details or practical details as he was launching out in pursuit of his ideals. So a very flawed founder, but a very inspiring person as well, whose writings continue to give us much to think about. Hope you have a fantastic day, and thank you for spending this time with me.